In the 1940s and 50s, St. Chrysostom's was noted for being an extremely low church, and parishioners of that era would have been very shocked to be aware that when it was founded in 1893, it was considered high church. This is indicated by the fact that it chose as its name a saint who is not in the prayer book calendar and is not mentioned in Scripture. When Joanna Zander wrote her history, she brushed aside this and said that they'd taken the name of the saint because his feast day was the closest one to the day of the first service in the parish, and cited the prayer of St. Chrysostom in the prayer book. But many years later, I spoke to Carl Gurdeau, who was at that time on Frank Griswold's diocesan staff, and he said, oh, absolutely, if the church hadn't been high church, they never would have picked that name. In fact, St. James Church, at the time St. Chrysostom's was founded, was extremely low church, and a number of people from St. James transferred to St. Chrysostom's because of this. The issue doesn't seem to have been a major one from 1900s into the early 1930s. One interesting thing I found in a parish bulletin, given the low church background in the 40s and 50s, was a note saying that countless thousands of souls have found in sacramental confession the joy of restored Christian fellowship, which would have raised a lot of eyebrows in 1940. George Craig Stewart, who became Bishop of Chicago in 1930, was very high church himself, but didn't try to make any changes in the parish's churchmanship, and his relationship with St. Chrysostom's was very good, and a lot of parishioners were active in the diocese. But after he died in 1940, and there was an election for his successor, churchmanship was a major issue. And there was a high church candidate from one of the Caribbean islands, I can't remember which, and among the low church candidates was our rector, Dudley Stark. The election was extremely heated and went on for several ballots. People stepped out and said they would not be in contention, it would not to be a candidate, and then would get back in contention. And after several days, they finally called off the convention and put it off for a month, at which time they had lined up a new high church candidate, Wallace Conkling, from a parish in Pennsylvania. He was elected, and Stark finished second, which cannot certainly have helped relationships between Conkling and Stark. And Conkling was, I think, for sure not the only bishop of the period who wanted to have all the churches in the diocese conform to his preferences. And St. Chrysostom's objected to this, and relationships got very bad. Conkling didn't like it that communion was administered by intinction first, and did not like it that we allowed people in love and charity with their neighbors to receive communion even if they had not been confirmed. Cuthbert Pratt came to St. Chrysostom's as Stark's assistant in 1944, shared Stark's views, and was possibly that was one of the reasons why he was called to the parish. And in 1950, Stark was elected the Bishop of Rochester, and St. Chrysostom's was looking for a new rector. Nowadays, the assistant would automatically be excluded from consideration as the rector's successor. But that wasn't the case at this time. It didn't happen very often, but it was legal. And the vestry, after some consideration, chose Cuthbert Pratt as Stark's successor, and relayed this to Bishop Conkling, who met with them in a very heated meeting and objected very strongly, but after some time he finally gave in. In the years from the 1930s to the 1950s, and actually I think earlier, Holy Communion was never called the Eucharist, and certainly never referred to as Mass, was held only was on the first Sunday of the month, with the exception of Christmas and Easter. Pentecost, Bishop's Visitation, other major feasts, no, it was still morning prayer. And Cuthbert Pratt, when looking for assistance, would not hire anyone from Seabury because that was too close ties to the diocese, and he figured that the assistants would be too high church, and he would contact Bishop Conkling before he made a visitation to St. Chrysostom's and asked him not to wear his cope and mitre. And the parish got really pretty much dissociated from any diocesan activity. Conkling resigned in 1953, and his successor, Bishop Gerald Francis Burrell, was also high church, but did not feel that it was necessary for all churches to conform to his churchmanship. And he apparently made some overtures to the parish, hoping for better relations, but that didn't have any good effect. Cuthbert Pratt left in 1958, and the vestry call to Bob Hall when they chose him as rector asked that he invite all who have made a general confession and are in love and charity with their neighbors to receive the sacrament, to administer it by intinction as well as by the common cup, not to substitute other publications such as the American Missal for the Book of Common Prayer, to conduct baptisms privately unless otherwise agreed to by the parents, and to use morning prayer at the 11 o'clock service except on the first Sunday of the month and other special Sundays at which communion has traditionally been served. Bishop Burrell made no objection to this. Relationships immediately improved dramatically when Hall came. Bishop Burrell in person instituted him as rector, and parish and its members became more involved in diocesan activity. A few months after Hall came, he got a letter from Father Orick, who was the rector at that time at the Church of the Atonement, inviting him to be guest preacher at an evening mass, I believe either All Saints or Epiphany, a major feast. And Hall got on the phone immediately and called up and said, I'd be delighted to accept. And there was this short silence from Father Orick on the other end of the phone, and he said, if I had known you would accept, I would have called you. But he said, I was almost certain that no one from St. Chrysostom's would ever want to come to Ascension, and I didn't want to embarrass you by making you have to come up with an excuse on the spur of the moment. And Hall came and he went to the service and he reported back and he said, it's not my type of service. I'm certainly not going to introduce any of the practices there, but it's what they want to do, and they should be allowed to do it, and hopefully the two parishes could cooperate. He hired a Nashotah House graduate as assistant a couple of years later. The man was engaged to a student at Northwestern, and they wanted to be married, and she didn't want to transfer to another school, so he wanted a Chicago parish. And he, at first, seemed Hall had no objections to a Nashotah grad, and the assistant at first had no problems with being there, but he partly didn't like the churchmanship and partly found that he and his wife missed their native California, and after a year the mutual decision was made that he would leave. At first, when they had intinction, they had a separate cup for administering it, and that was discontinued in 1962 with no objections from the congregation. In 1962 also, Bishop James Montgomery, who was the high church candidate, was elected suffragan bishop of the diocese. And although he was supposed to be high church, the woman who had been his nurse when he was a baby was a member at St. Chrysostom's, and she was just delighted that her little boy had been elected bishop, but she didn't live to see the consecration. She died that summer, and the bishop called St. Chrysostom's, and he said, "I know this is not your tradition, but I would like, it's the last thing I can do for her, to have a Requiem Eucharist in Edith's memory." And Bob Hall was away on vacation, but the assistant figured it was all right and said, "Go ahead." And he had just graduated from Episcopal Divinity School and was Low Church himself, and Mother was on Alder Guild at the time, and neither of them knew, they were a little bit panicky about how they were going to manage things, but it all worked out fine, and nobody in the congregation had objections. They felt that this was a very valid thing for him to do. The call to Bob Hall had mentioned not having public baptisms unless the parents approved, and I don't ever remember any public baptisms, and I'm not sure whether there ever were any, but in 1961, Bob Hall and his wife became parents of their fifth child, a daughter, and the baptism was held at the 11 o'clock service, partly because they wanted it to be for the congregation, but also because the Sunday school curriculum at that time for the kindergarten had a section on baptism about how Susan got her name, and this baby was named Susan. Bob Hall left to become Bishop of Virginia in 1966, and Bob Howell succeeded him in 1967. When the 65th anniversary of the parish came, they decided, instead of the founding of the parish, Bob Howell had only just come and was still getting used to things, that they would observe as the 75th anniversary, the 75th anniversary of the first service on the site in November 1894. And Joanna Zander, in doing research for the parish history, discovered that the parish had never been consecrated, and it was agreed that this would be a great thing to do on that day. And the diocesan bishops couldn't make it, but retired Bishop Stark was contacted, and he was invited to come, and this was really even a better choice. And they had the service of consecration, which you would think would be accompanied by the Eucharist, but the service was going to be so long, and it was the first Sunday, so it would have been natural, but because the service was so long, Bob Howell said no, they weren't going to have the celebration because it would make the service even longer. It was by now a diocesan requirement that the bishop confirm in cope and mitre, and Bishop Montgomery would do this but would apologize to the congregation on doing so. In 1976, interesting thing happened. We had a vacancy for an assistant, and Scott Helferty, who had been the assistant at the Church of the Ascension, spoke to his rector, and with the rector's consent applied for the vacancy at St. Chrysostom's and was accepted. He did not come in with any desire to make any drastic changes. He came in with more of a high church background, but did not try to push anything on people. Also, by this, Bishop Burrell had, before he retired sometime in the 60s, he had said that churchmanship was much less of an issue than it had been when he first became bishop, and I think seeing the history of St. Chrysostom's that we can be sure that this was right. By the late 1970s, although we still stuck to Eucharist on the first Sunday, we did have it at some of the special feast days like Pentecost, and the Eucharist was always had it at the bishop's visitation, which had not been the case previously. When they had remodeled the church interior in 1981 and had worshipped in the guild room for the summer, they had a special service the first time we were back in the church itself, and for that they did celebrate the Eucharist. Also, Bob Howell celebrated the 30th anniversary of his ordination at St. Chrysostom's in 1984, and on that occasion they celebrated the Eucharist. In the fall of 1988, Bob Howell decided to introduce the Eucharist at the third Sunday service at 11 o'clock. This was as a service directed mainly to the Sunday school, and he put in a lot of changes to make the service more child-friendly, which were not well received, but there was absolutely no complaint about having the Eucharist itself at that time. The service schedule still said Holy Eucharist first and third Sundays, morning prayer second, fourth, and fifth Sundays. And it's interesting that when Ray Webster came in 1992, that The Eucharist began to be held on the fifth Sunday as well, and the Eucharist was seen as the default, and they specified that morning prayer was on the second and fourth Sundays. Beginning in 1967, one of the big issues which really superseded churchmanship pretty much, I think, was the changes in the liturgy. In 1967, you had mandated trial use of the Green Book by Bishop Burrell from Advent 1967 through Easter 1968, and they surveyed the congregation, which was about equally divided pro and con. And there were other trial uses that were put in fall 1971. There was the Zebra Book, and elderly parishioner died just before or just after trial use of this book was scheduled, and her sister was arranging the funeral. Bob Howell was away on vacation, and it was his assistant who was taking it over. And she said, "Please don't use the new prayer book." And he said, "Don't worry." He said, the trial use will not be in effect at the time of your sister's funeral. And she said, "Oh, I don't mean that prayer book. My sister and I never liked the 28 prayer book. We thought the 1892 prayer book was much better, so I would like you to use that for the funeral," which apparently was done. The parish took polls after all of the trial uses, and there was never a favorite. What was never favored was the revised Lord's Prayer, and the exchange of the peace was at first not at all popular, but there was more favorable reference than I would have expected to the revised language for the prayers. The 1979 prayer book had to be approved at 2 successive general conventions, and the vote in 1976 was so lopsided in favor of the new book that it was obvious it would be approved 3 years later, and general convention authorized congregations to start using it, so Bob Howell bought copies. And we had at this time 2 assistants. We had Scott Helferty, who had come to us from the high church background of Ascension, and we had Bill Sachs, who was a graduate of Virginia Theological Seminary and was part-time at St. Chrysostom's while working toward a doctor's degree. And the 2 of them gave an excellent series of Sunday morning programs on the new prayer book and discussed why the changes were made, and were very honest about their reactions. They liked most of them, but if they didn't like them, they were very upfront about what it was that they didn't care for. And just after Easter, they 1979, use of the new prayer book began, and they started with Rite 1 so it would be as similar as possible. But there was not a baptismal service in Rite 1, and there was a baptism at one of the services about a month later, and they used Rite 2. And the reaction was amazingly positive. Everybody just thought this was wonderful and just wanted them far better than the old service. Some of the newer members of the congregation who were more used to the modern language wanted Rite 2 to be used more often, and we did it for a period in 78 and then returned to Rite 1 most of the time, 79 on through 81. When we were having the services in the Guild Room in that summer of 81, we were using Rite 1 for the Eucharist, and I remember telling Bob Howell, I said, you know, you tell everybody that we should come and be dressed informally, and we should be relaxed. And then we have this very Elizabethan style language. Don't don't you think while we're upstairs we should use right too? And Bob said, well, you've made an interesting point. I'll think about it. Well, the next Sunday when the Eucharist was to be celebrated at the service, sure enough, we used right to, and apparently nobody objected. And so after that, we would switch back and forth. Usually we'd do right one, Advent through Epiphany, and then Lent and Easter would be right two, and then there'd be some, I think the Easter season we were back in right one, and then for Pentecost back to right two. I mentioned that the congregation at first really didn't like the exchange of the peace. On Thanksgiving weekend in 1979, there was a provincial youth conference that met in Chicago, and for some reason, work was going on in the cathedral and they couldn't have the closing Eucharist there, so they came to St. Chrysostom's. And all these young people were in our 11 o'clock service, and it comes time for the peace, and they're all getting out of their pews and going around and shaking hands with everybody, and the congregation absolutely loved it. And at the next Eucharist, every people in the congregation are getting up again and going around and shaking hands like these kids had done. And this was a really nice thing to happen. Bob Howell didn't like morning prayer right two. He always used right one. But when Ray came and we switched back and forth, right one, right two, he went to using right two. And we did the switch for the first year or so that he was there, and then one year during Advent, when Advent was coming, he forgot to make the switch, and we went on with right two, and there were no objections, so it was, he figured, well, if there isn't any objection, then we'll keep on with it. I think once or twice occasionally we've had a special service where they've used right one, but it is only very infrequent. One thing that we have maintained over the years is that people strongly do want to continue having morning prayer 2 Sundays a month at 11. When they started the 9 o'clock service, that was begun as the Eucharist and has continued, and no one has objected to that. But I was on the 1992 search committee that called Ray Webster, and the poll of the congregation, one thing that stood out strongly was that people wanted morning prayer to continue twice a month. And this after Ray retired, our acting rector wanted to get us to have communion once at 11 o'clock every Sunday, but once again there was strong opposition, and she did not carry this out. And I think that does it.